Thanks, Melissa. And so that's our reminder, just to let folks know that we will be recording this and it will be posted on our website after this event once we get a chance to clean up the video and get it ready for publication. But again, this will be recorded. And so if you don't mind, please make sure that your audio is muted and feel free to stay on camera or go off if you would prefer. But we will be recording this presentation. All right. Melissa, how we doing? We ready to, looks like waiting room's here. Perfect. All right. So again, I appreciate everyone here for joining us today. If we want to go to the next slide. So my name is Paul Sell. I'm Associate
Hey,
Director.
Paul, real
Yeah.
quick, Brian Detman here. Maybe I don't, does everybody see the slideshow? Maybe we should just confirm that.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah. Good point. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Brian. All right. Yes. So my name is Paul Sell, Associate Director here at Youth Development Oregon. My role here with the agency is I oversee our competitive grants as well as our community engagement and events like this. So again, just appreciate everybody's time for joining us. Over the past 3 weeks, we've done 6 in-person events, and so this will be the virtual event accompanying all of those events. This will be a little bit more modified and kind of a more webinar style. But again, I'll turn it over to Brian and we'll go into a little bit more details here in just a minute.
Thanks so much, Paul. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Really appreciate folks taking the time to show up for this virtual version of our community conversations. Paul and I have had really outstanding time on the road. We're just doing our community conversation in Pendleton yesterday. We've been, yeah, in the sort of 2.5, 3 weeks, starting in the Portland metro area, then to Redmond in Central Oregon. Then we did a kind of a little more of a valley and coastal swing from Lincoln City to Eugene to Medford. And then, as mentioned, back to Pendleton yesterday. It's been really great to see folks in person. We use as an opportunity not only to share information, but to make some connections and network a little bit. So we have a number of folks joining us. We've got our staff um, online. And Paul, do you want me to kick it back to you to kind of let folks sort of mention to them what they should do in terms of putting their names in the chat? But
Oh,
just welcome everybody. Thanks. Back to you, Paul.
sounds good. Thanks, Brian. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So just a little bit about today, and then we'll go through some housekeeping stuff. So today we're really going to spend some time talking around agency overview and our budget, who YDO is, just that kind of overview to help folks recognize and kind of remember who we are. And then we'll move more into our strategic plan and agency focus as we then roll into talking about what our grant making in 2025-27 looks like. So hopefully you'll kind of see the flow of today, and it'll help guide you through that process. On the right side of the screen, you also see Take the Survey. That's a QR code, so you can use your phone. I think we tried it before we went virtual today. Should work off of your screen. That is a survey to really help us make sure that we're
Okay, I was like, I'm not gonna deal with this.
all right. If you don't mind, please keep muted. But that's a QR code to take you to a survey that will help both us just get feedback about this information, but just kind of spoiler alert. You may not know all the answers if you start taking that survey right now. That's kind of the intention of that to help guide you through this presentation and learn about some of the new things that we'll see as we roll into the 25-27 biennium. So the next slide, please. So just some housekeeping stuff. If you can remain muted unless called upon by Brian and I. Brian and I will be the main facilitators today. And we do ask that if you are going to speak, if you do turn on your camera during that time, like outside of that, feel free to stay off camera or be on camera, whatever you prefer. Cord's going to be behind the scenes monitoring chat. And so he'll be working to respond. So if you want to open the chat box as well, you'll help see some of those responses to those questions throughout this presentation. And as like most things that we do have the disclaimer there that all RFA materials are in final development right now. They're actually in what's called legal sufficiency, getting ready to be released in the coming months. And so that's the RFA is the official guidance for each RFA once published. Today's presentation is just and information is a non-biased dialogue to share what to anticipate as we roll into that. And then there'll be those more formal presentations as part of each RFA in the pre-conference application, which is outlined in the RFA once published. So with that, I think I'm done with the intro stuff. Just looking back to you, Cord. Doesn't look like there's anything in chat or any questions about kind of what we're doing today. Oh,
No, nothing in the chat, but
all right.
I will be monitoring it, and feel free
Awesome.
at any point to drop questions in there. We'll probably take some breaks periodically for us to share out what's in the chat, and I'll also try to answer in the chat while things are moving.
Perfect. Sounds good. All right. Oh, and I should mention, so Melissa will be sharing the PDF version of this presentation, I believe, in chat here in a bit, as well as it will be posted on our website later this week, early next week with this recording of this video. All right. With that, Brian, I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Paul. And again, for the record, I don't know if I said this, Brian Detman, Youth Development Oregon Director. We do ask folks, I'm not looking at the chat, but if you don't mind, feel free to put your name and your organization. Feel free to put your role or title if you want, but name and organization in the chat so we understand and others who are listening and watching can kind of see who's in the room. So yeah, we appreciate your dropping that in. We'll also have our staff throw their names and titles in. Also, any Youth Development Council folks will put their names in. Just again, big thanks to our team who are here online, our staff team are online and making all this happen. Paul, big thanks to you for organizing a ton of this. Tanasia and Melissa certainly have done a ton of work getting this going and off the ground. And we're kind of to this point with this virtual one, which is I don't know if I don't want this to represent the end. This is the beginning, right? As we move into the next phase. So I see a bunch of folks dropping their names in the chat, so that way you can kind of get a sense of who's listening in, maybe some opportunity for you to chime in. Might even see a former Youth Development Division staff in the room.
Brian, this is Melissa. Your audio just dropped.
Did it drop? Can you
Yep.
hear me now?
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Maybe it's getting a little bit better. Anyone else? Okay.
I'll turn off my video. Melissa,
That's much better. Thank you.
I'll turn off the video. So I was just saying, okay, yep, there goes our Bobby. Appreciate that. He can hear. Yeah, Aaron can hear. Good. If at some point I'm looking at the chat now, if you lose me or Paul, let us know. We'll pivot as needed. Great. Now I'm going to keep us moving forward. As I said, I've kind of got the first third or so of the presentation today, talking a little bit about the agency, talking a bit about our budget, talking a little bit about our strategic plan. So I'm just going to keep it moving. Thanks, Tanasia, for the slide. What we're looking at right now is just kind of a quick kind of context for. I'm going to turn my video back on, and then somebody tell me if that affects things. I think an important thing for folks to understand is that we're our own standalone independent agency. My role is governor appointed. Our council members are also appointed by the governor. Our council is our governing body. So on this, you see the Youth Development Council, which was brought together more than a dozen years ago and was first created as the Oregon Commission on Children and Families. Structure was dissolved, and out of that, the many various responsibilities and duties of that commission went to different places. Several of the sort of administering grant funds and doing a fair amount of work around the juvenile justice work that statewide was given to the Youth Development Council. So we're really just appreciative to have more than 20 different council members, maybe a couple of whom are on the line that are doing great work to sort of advise and pass different policies and give us direction overall. The division is really where our staff sits, and that's the body that I lead as director. Again, we're independent agency. I consider us kind of small and mighty. Folks sometimes have heard of YDD or Youth Development Division, or YDC, the council. What we're moving towards, just to maybe, I don't know, I hope it simplifies, but it might just give you another acronym that you have to manage, and that's Youth Development Oregon, really representing the work of the council and the division collectively under one kind of shared name, Youth Development Oregon. We'll use YDD. You'll hear references to YDC. We'll probably today be using YDO, or Youth Development Oregon. I think an important piece for you all to understand is that, again, we're an independent state agency. As I've explained, our budget does sit in the Department of Education, though we are not a body that's reporting to the State Board of Education. Our budget does sit within the Department of Education, and we partner with the Department of Education for certain kind of business services that we don't have the capacity to manage, IT and procurement and human resources, to name a few of those areas. The IT function, for example, right? You'll see in our email that our email handles involve, like, I'm brian.detman@ODE, or Oregon Department of Education @oregon.gov. So that's because of the business relationship that we have with ODE. And as it concerns our request for applications, procurement is managed, and the authority around procurement does rest with the Department of Education. So we partner very closely with the department on procurement efforts. That will come into context as Paul talks about, again, requests for applications, as he talks about the single point of contact, SPC, which sits at the Department of Education, but also understand our, again, independence. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our budget here in a second. All right, next slide. So our vision: all of Oregon's youth have the opportunity to thrive and achieve their full potential. Our mission is to align systems and invest in communities to ensure equitable and effective services for youth ages 6 through 24 throughout Oregon and tribal nations. We support educational and career success, disrupt youth crime and violence, and affirm youth strength and safety. This comes out of our strategic plan that we developed a couple of years ago. I'm going to talk a little bit here in a few minutes about the newest plan that we're developing, but just I think this is what brings us to this work. I know we are, as an agency, doing quite a bit of grant making and administering of dollars and legislation which supports youth and families. We're particularly interested in trying to deal with those gaps and barriers and hurdles that youth and families experience. And so that's really the focus of our work. Next slide. So by statute, a little bit more specifics. Our statutes do guide us to be able to support programs and services from a pretty broad range, age 6 to 24. A fair amount of our work, probably the majority of our work, does support kind of teens and young adults. But again, we've got early literacy programs and supports for after school programs and in different out of school time activities. Again, we're particularly focused on those young people facing barriers to and experiencing disparities in education. Many of the programs that we are supporting are working with justice involved or foster care involved young people navigating homelessness and houselessness and poverty, youth and students with specific unique needs and disabilities. As I mentioned, a lot of out of school time work and young people who are disconnected or out of the education, the kind of public education space. And so we're helping reconnect them back to a certificate of some kind, whether it's a high school diploma or GED. And again, we'll talk more about some of our emerging work and youth workforce readiness and workforce development. Next slide. The grants that we're going to talk a lot about kind of our competitive grant making today. We have some dollars that we also administer, which are in the juvenile justice realm. So we're not going to spend time there, but you'll see a slide here in a little bit that Paul will explain and share that talks about kind of the youth grants portfolio, which is our focus today, and then our juvenile justice grants, which is not what we'll be focusing on today, but we do again support a number of programs through counties and tribes around juvenile justice. This is a list you all can read in terms of the kinds of things that are happening currently and historically with our grants. It's pretty broad and varied. One of the things we hear from grantees is that we can support a pretty broad and varied work, and that our funds tend to be pretty flexible. And so that's something we really appreciate, from the direct service work that many of you are doing to other kind of capacity building, system improvement, community coordination, community connection work. So it's exciting for us to be able to support such a range of different kinds of programs. I'll also say quickly, you're going to see a number of photos in this presentation that come directly from our grantees. Again, deep appreciation and gratitude for all the work that you're doing out in communities, and the reporting that you have to do to us is something we appreciate. The sharing of photos, the sharing of stories of success, the sharing of stories of the sort of peaks and valleys that youth and families experience. We just are really appreciative and have the real privilege to be able to share at least some of the images that we've gotten from our grantees as a part of this presentation. Next slide. So I'm going to keep us moving because I know I probably want to get done in the next 5 minutes or so. A number of factors on our budget. The economic forecast, which just came out fairly in the last few days, was fairly positive. Governor's budget came out in December. The governor's budget did have a reduction in our grant funding, so we're managing with that. But ultimately, it's the legislature that develops and passes the budget for the state. So we'll see, given that we're in legislative session, how things proceed with the legislature. I give my presentation to the Joint Committee on Ways and Means Education Subcommittee next week, if I'm not mistaken, on the 12th, Wednesday the 12th in the afternoon, between 1 and like 2:30. So if you're somebody who pays attention to that kind of thing and can go on to the Oregon Legislative Information System, you could see that presentation on March 12th. We have some money that's expiring, our Future Ready funds, because those are federal dollars. And we're all, as I imagine you all are doing, we're all monitoring what's happening at the federal level. We do have a big chunk, nearly $6 million, which come through Title 20, or the Social Service Block Grant Fund. And that those dollars, if they were to be cut, would impact our community investments pretty dramatically. So I don't have new information. We're watching, but it would reduce some of a chunk of our community investment fund, which Paul will talk about here in a sec. Next slide. Yeah.
Sorry, I just threw my hand up to try to also mention that we have tentative dates for public testimony on the
good.
budget. Right now, we've heard that March 26th and 27th, there'll be an opportunity for the public to testify on the ODE budget, including the YDD budget. So we'll probably be able to share more details when we have the exact date. It usually is one day specifically for our testimony, but if folks are interested in doing that, we're happy to share the opportunity for you to speak to the legislature.
Awesome. Thanks, Cord.
Thanks.
Estimated youth grant, our budget on the left is our current biennial budget. I'm not going to read all the percentages to you, but you kind of can see this, how funds are distributed for us. And again, these are competitive grant funds, right? This is not our total budget. It's our youth grants budget. We obviously have a budget for our administration. We've also have our juvenile justice dollars, but these just are focusing on youth grants. And then on the right, you can kind of see our budget that was developed as a part of the governor's budget, but not our final budget, right? But there was that reduction, which I mentioned earlier, and you can kind of see how the funds are distributed in the governor's recommended budget. We'll see where the legislature lands. We are creating a new job and work readiness fund to replace the Future Ready funding. So Paul will talk about that in a second. The re-engagement dollars are funded by the Student Success Act and the Corporate Activities Tax. So also we'll be watching how those funds are doing. The economic forecast did indicate that there's not as much revenue being collected there. So we'll see if that impacts the re-engagement dollars. Next slide. Our strategic plan, Cord and other staff and our council are working really strongly on our strategic plan. So we just appreciate that. Just watch for our website when we post that plan. Some of you may have been engaged in some of that process over the summer. We had a retreat earlier in the fall. So lots happening there. Next slide. There are three overarching imperatives of our plan. These are not listed in any particular order. There are just three of them, but around prevention and intervention work, stopping those problems before they occur, or trying to intervene so that they don't get worse, and promoting resiliency and positive youth development. Connection and change. We understand and value relationships and the connection that exists between caring adults and young people, between organizations through collaboration and collective impact, and the local work that's happening on the ground at a grassroots level, and that change and system transformation, either change on an individual level or at a systemic level, is happening really through relationship and connection. And the last, but again, not particularly ordered, but equity and transparency. We're committed to serving those young people and families that are furthest from opportunity, committed to also being as transparent as we can about our process and places where we have room for improvement. Next slide. There are 8 strategies in our plan. We don't have time today to get into the weeds on all 8 of these, but one that I wanted to highlight was around engaging and sharing power with youth. For all the people sitting in on today's call, hey, be in touch if you have interest in our council, or if you have a young person who might be a good candidate for our council. Again, those positions are governor appointed, but I am in constant recruitment mode and eager to have conversations with interested candidates. Next slide. Just a little more on that strategy. I'll mention around particularly youth or those with lived expertise. We do have some compensation opportunity, right? We can make a stipend for those who qualify for that to serve on our council. We do reimburse for mileage and getting to meetings and things like that. So that recruitment piece is important, and know that there's again some compensation opportunity. We're eager to develop ways to align our activities for really being more youth focused in our grantee convenings, in our council meetings. So there's work for us to do, but eager to kind of stay engaged with youth. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the sharing of stories and sharing of the impact of the work that you're all doing, we want to do our best to elevate that. And you'll see that in my budget presentation next week. Next slide. So full plan will be on our website soon. So stay tuned for that. In terms of next steps, we'll probably present on our strategic plan in our June quarterly meeting. So again, if you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to me or Paul, and we'll direct you to whoever, maybe to Cord, or maybe there's just sitting in on one of our council meetings. I think I've kind of come to the end, tried to breeze through. That was quick and fast. But since we have 35 minutes, I want to turn it over to Paul, because I think he's got probably about 30 minutes of content to share. Next slide. Yeah, I finished my pieces. Appreciate your time this morning. Cord, I know you're monitoring chat. I appreciate your jumping in on the opportunity later this month for public testimony. Paul, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks, everybody.
Sounds great. Cord, I haven't seen anything, but just double checking. All right, perfect. On that, again, for those of you that may have joined a little bit late, my name is Paul Sell, Associate Director here at Youth Development Oregon. And so my main part this morning is going to talk a little bit about what our YDO, or Youth Development Oregon, grant making looks like as we go into the new biennium. And so appreciate Brian going through some of those higher level items around agency focus, and really encourage you to dive deeper into that as you're working on the application process, or the request for application, RFA process, should you decide to apply for these upcoming grants. Again, that's the survey in there. Melissa put the direct link. So if you're at your computer, you can access that, and hopefully you'll be able to answer some of those questions as we go through, if I'm doing my job in terms of presenting this information for you. So next slide, please. So as Brian talked about with our budget, there's really kind of two sides or two areas of grant aid, what we call grant and aid funding. So funding that goes out to support youth services across the state. On that bottom, that second box there, the juvenile justice and delinquency prevention funds. Those are not funds that we'll be really talking about today. A lot of those funds live in what we call formula funds that are directly awarded to counties and tribes, every county and every federally recognized tribe across the state. And so those aren't what we're going to focus on today. So if you are part of that system, just know that that'll be some upcoming information as we roll into 25-27. What we're going to focus on today is what we call our youth grants portfolio, and it's really focused on prevention, intervention, and support, and that disconnection of youth from school or work and our other risk factors that affect youth across the state. Next slide, please. As we said earlier, this will be published. I think it's actually in the chat, but if you also want to take a photo of this, it's totally fine. Our 25-27 youth grants portfolio looks different than what you may have seen in the past if you've joined us for these in previous years. So where we spent a lot of time in the last 8 months really diving deep into our processes and how do we present the information and help guide people into the funding streams that make most sense for the services that you're providing as an organization to youth. And you may have joined us in a work group, and we want to be over these past eight months, but we want to be very transparent of where we are in terms of it. So kind of jumping back to what our last grant cycle looked like. We had over 400 applications across all of our RFAs that we were released at the same time. And what that did is it, quite frankly, flooded our system. And so we wanted to dive deeper into this idea of how do we present the portfolio of grants that we can offer to your organization. So when we look at this slide, you can see that there's 4 main funding streams, and those will be individual requests for application processes that are published for it, or the RFA. And so that first one is re-engagement opportunity, and we call it the ROG for an acronym, and that is specifically designed for youth reconnection to education. And so there's some very specific legislation around the age range that can be served and the services within that. And you might notice in that one box it says serves ages 14 through 24. And that's the age limit that is defined in legislation that we can serve within that. And again, that's that connection back to education for youth that have left or are high risk of leaving. That RFA will look very similar to what you've seen in the past in terms of that grant. When we move further to the right in those next 3 RFAs, these are going to look different than what you've seen in the past of this process. So job and work readiness, as Brian alluded earlier, is that Future Ready is sunsetting. Those were some limited duration funds that we received over the past 3 years. And what we found in facilitating those funds is that the youth connection to workforce is a critical component to the work that we do as an agency. And so this is a new grant for us that we call Job and Work Readiness, or JWR. And when we dive deeper into that, we see it says primarily serves ages 16 through 24. And that the word primarily is really important because as an applicant, that's what you're going to focus on when you apply for these funds. We wanted to allow flexibility where flexibility was appropriate in terms of it. So primarily is if you may have a 15-year-old that makes sense to have some of these services, and you would work with your grant manager if you were successful to find if that would be appropriate use of funds within that. But again, you're narrowing your application to the age ranges that are identified on it. And that grant is really focused on the youth connection to workforce. When we move into community investments, that's one of the RFAs that it has the same name, but you're going to notice some pretty significant changes in that request for application. Now, community investments in the past have had what we called initiatives within it. We no longer have those. We've divided them out into these separate RFAs. And so community investments is our broadest grant. It serves really the broadest amount of youth through positive youth development programming. And that can look like after school programming, that can look at really positive opportunities for youth to engage with positive young people as well as adults to help them find more success in both education and career. So that primarily serves ages 6 through 19. So that's that school age range. And again, it may make sense for your organization to work a little bit outside of that 19 range We cannot serve as an agency any youth younger than 6, but there is some flexibility there. You would work with your grant manager if you're successful in that. Another new RFA for us, which used to be an initiative, is called the Youth Violence and Gang Reduction Grant. And that's going to be very specific youth violence and gang reduction programming. So that can be direct outreach or other things that are going to help youth from connecting or being involved with violence or gang or gun-based activities within that work. So more to come on that. But again, you also notice that the primarily serves ages 16 through 24. And the reason that we're doing that is we really want to focus that grant on almost that secondary prevention. So once a youth has had some involvement, we want these funds to really focus on making sure that they're and prevent them from having further involvement in that process. The community investments, that's why the age is a little bit younger, will be more focused on really positive youth services, which we know impacts youth involved in it on that work. Another note about the youth gangs portfolio, as you can see down there on the bottom, the re-engagement and workforce convenings is required activities for re-engagement and job and work readiness. Those are twice yearly in-person meetings that we bring all of our grantees together to look at expanding services in specific zones across the state. I'm going to hit pause for that because that was a pretty hefty slide. It doesn't look like anything's coming in chat. So I'm going to go ahead and have Tanisha take us to the next slide. And so the goal of these next few slides is really to have you think about that model or that portfolio that we just showed on it. So what I would encourage you to do is just to hear the first sentence of the RFA that I'll read aloud that's not on the screen, and really think about the goals of these individual grants. The idea is to think about your first initial reaction of what you hear. If you say, yes, that is what we do for youth, that is probably a grant you want to explore more. If you're like, well, that's really not what we do, then that may not be an RFA for you or your organization for the project that you're thinking about applying for. Also to note, you might notice down there in that bottom bullet, there's some capitalized words in the middle of the sentence, and that is a very specific thing that happens in RFAs. And if you haven't read an RFA for a while, that actually means that's a defined term that you would use the RFA in that process. And just answering that question, yes, this is being recorded and the slides will be sent out. And I believe they're already actually in the chat for you. All right, so for the Re-Engagement Opportunity Grant, this grant supports programming to reach, engage, and serve youth who have unenrolled or fully disconnected from high school prior to earning a diploma or equivalent. So when you hear that first sentence of that RFA and you see those bolded words, think about if that's a program that you're currently doing for serving youth. And noting that re-engagement services are very specific services that are outlined in the RFA, as well as eligible youth, which are specific to re-engagement around that work. Next slide, please. So the Job and Work Readiness Grant, you can see that some of those goals have shifted really towards that youth connection to workforce. So the first kind of defining sentence of the RFA is the Job and Work Readiness Grant supports community-based youth development efforts to develop skills that lead to and improve employment readiness for young people. So just really want to stress that it's not about that career connection or that career option for the next 30 years for young people. It's about that developing skills and that connection to be more successful as they move into career. So we want it to be a youth-focused opportunity. You'll also notice that there are some capitalized words in there that will be defined in the RFA that you'll want to pay close attention to. Next slide, please. You'll notice that this slide gets a little bit broader in the services. And so the Community Investment Grant supports community-based youth development efforts to provide proven practices and innovative approaches to serve youth furthest from opportunity. And so think about when you hear the phrase youth furthest from opportunity, which is a defined phrase in the RFA, but you take your initial thought of thinking, what does that mean to me and the programming and the youth that we serve in our community? And then looking at the goals, just again, noting it's about increased youth engagement, reducing barriers and support, and that safe and welcoming programming for youth. This last one, so next slide, please, is our Youth Violence and Gang Reduction Grant. And you might notice that this gets a lot more specific, but the Youth Violence and Gang Reduction Grant supports community-based supports to disrupt and prevent youth from committing or becoming victims of gun and or violent crime. And now that we've kind of gone through all three of those RFAs, what I'd like to do is just pause for a second to see if there's any questions and I would encourage YDO staff if I missed something in this to do it. But then while we're pausing and addressing any questions there might be, think about what of those four definitions of grants that might make sense for you. Cord?
I don't think you missed anything, but there was a question in the chat that just popped up. So I'll answer it or I'll read it and answer it. And essentially the question is, if our programming lines up with more than one grant area, are there any guidelines against applying for multiple grants? And the answer in short is that we're going to talk about limitations on number of applications in this presentation. So stay tuned. You may get an answer to what you're thinking about. And if you have additional questions, once we've talked about the limitations around applications, feel free to ask them.
Thanks, Gord. All right, so if we can go to the next slide. Well, the next, I'd say 4 or 5 slides are going to be really more specific about changes that are going to anticipate as these RFAs roll out. I should also note that I think is an important thing to think about is this presentation, as well as the pre-conference application meetings or pre-application conference webinars are not to substitute reading the RFA. I can't stress enough that once these RFAs are released, that you take some time to review it in length. And yes, recognizing that they can be upwards of 80 pages in terms of that. But that's really going to guide you in terms of what and where you should apply and how to address the evaluation questions in that work within it. So as I said earlier, about 8 months ago, we really dove deep into saying, what does our processes look like and how can we really help people see where to apply in these applications? And so some key terms that are going to be added to the RFAs across all 4 of these are youth furthest from opportunity. And that's going to be a defined term or phrase that really focuses on youth that are facing barriers to success in education and employment. And it includes Oregon's protected class, but even more broadly than just priority populations that you might have seen in Future Ready grant in these past bienniums. So you can include federally recognized tribal members, rural and frontier communities, even down to that work around if a youth is completing high school, that they may have an IEP, an individual education plan or a 504 plan within that, so that we want to allow that opportunity for these grants to support youth furthest from opportunity across all of those systems within that. So eligible youth, again, is a term specific to re-engagement, and so would encourage you to read that in detail before applying in re-engagement opportunity grant. And it's really around the age requirements being served and their disconnection from education. And so as a successful applicant, you would have to identify eligible youth as part of your reporting process within that. Now, when we think about returning grantee, and Melissa, I forgot to prep you on this. If you can maybe put that PDF into the chat, and it may take a minute. But we do have a draft process of, sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
Sorry, which PDF?
The returning grantee list.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
Awesome. So the returning grantee is a defined term for us. And so I'm going to take a minute just to kind of dive deeper into what that looks like. And so if you were a re-engagement opportunity grantee in 2021-23 biennium or 2023-24 biennium, you would be considered a returning grantee in re-engagement opportunity grants. And that has, in the next few slides, you'll see where that has some implication within that. And so a returning grantee is those successful grant or applicants that have received funds in the 21-23 biennium or the 23-25 biennium in a specific RFA type. And so going back to the example I just shared, re-engagement opportunity is an RFA type. And so that same applicant, if they did not receive Future Ready funds or workforce funds, they would not be considered a re-engagement grantee in that type, but they would be considered a returning grantee in re-engagement opportunity grants. And so in the chat, I would encourage you to open that list. This is a draft list of returning grantees by RFA type. And so some grantees may have received funds in in a community investment and re-engagement. And so they would be a returning grantee in both of those RFA types within it. Specific notes to future ready and workforce readiness initiative and community investments, you are considered a returning grantee in the new job and work readiness RFA. And that's, again, the programming is very similar. So it's just a new name. And so you are considered a returning grantee within that. All right, I'm going to pause there. It doesn't look like there's any questions, so I'll kind of let you open that as we keep moving forward. Sorry, Cord, did you have something?
Yeah, we have a question which I put a very brief answer to. The question is, any guidance at this time about including or avoiding acronyms getting a lot of attention federally, i.e. BIPOC, LGBTQ plus, as we craft our grant narratives? The answer I provided in the chat is there is not currently any guidance of this type for grant applications. Should anything change, that would be something that would be addressed in the RFA, but we are not currently contemplating any kind of specific, terminology that would be flagged or otherwise. I think as Paul noted earlier, most of these grants are state general fund supported grants, and are not federal dollars. There is one set of funding, the Title 20 or Social Service Block Grant dollars. Those are federal. They actually go to ODHS, or the Oregon Department of Human Services, and then they make a subaward to us. And our programming, the awards that we make to grantees, is not something that to date has ever been scrutinized at that level in terms of application language. That generally isn't something that is getting looked at. And so there is not any current guidance of this type, no restrictions. And we appreciate the question and understand why folks want to know. But yeah, right now there is nothing addressed of that sort in this presentation or in the RFAs.
Thank you, Gordon. And to note, as Cord indicated, we're closely watching that, and obviously we'll update processes as needed throughout that. All right, so jumping back to the definition, so an operational project, again, is a new term that we're going to start using. And when you hear that, and it'll be defined in the RFA, it's purposely not included in this slide presentation because that is still in process with our RFAs in legal sufficiency. But an operational project is essentially if we showed up to your programming, we could see programming and being given to youth in terms of that work. And so I actually need to jump back just a moment because I forgot to define what a project is. So programming is essentially what your organization does globally in terms of services for youth. The project is specific to what you're applying for the funds. And so when we talk about operational project would be what you are applying for at time of application that it is currently serving youth. And so if you have an after-school program that is operating when you decide to apply for a community investment grant, that would be considered an operational project. And that is further defined in the RFA around if you're a successful applicant, an operational project will have to be serving youth and reporting individual participant level data within 6 months of grant execution. Really important to note on that is that there is some funding tied to it, which we'll get to in just a moment. A new project, that means that it's something new, right? And we're excited about funding those as well, but we'll look into that in a deeper level on it. Individual level participant data is intake and outgoing information that participants will share with you in terms of coming into your programming. It is specific to the youth being served, which does include their name, date of birth, race, ethnicity, and gender as a few things to name with individual level participant data. But recognizing that will be submitted through a secure portal, it is something to note as we move deeper into the weeds of some things to address maybe some of the earlier questions I've seen in chat within that. Next slide, please. So these next few slides are going to be kind of in the weeds around the process. And one of the things that we've heard over the past several bienniums is what does the RFA and award process look like? And why don't we ever hear from you once we submit an application? So I want to take a minute just to really highlight what the Youth Development Oregon RFA processes look like. And just to note, yes, ODE procurement is our procurement officers and our single point of contact, or the SPC, in this process. But these processes are specific to YDO. So other Oregon Department of Education grants may look slightly different to this, but this is the process that we utilize in terms of that work. So when we look at an RFA, it's basically there's 5 areas that happen in that process. The first and the most kind of the biggest time is the release of RFA. And so that is when we announce that there is an application or request for application open for you to submit an application in. Just a note, if you did not receive information about this event through what's called Gov Delivery, it's an automated delivery system, that would indicate that you need to sign up for our email list for it as an agency, because that is where we release our information about RFA, upcoming RFAs and when they are open. So please take note to that, that happens. Once the release happens, we allow 60 days for the application process to happen. And you can see that's really the part you as an organization will be doing in this process, which is submitting your application. That includes organization information, addressing the evaluation criteria that's outlined there, letters of partnership, excuse me. Yeah, that actually does say letters of partnership, excuse me. Was a typo for the last few times of that. Your budget and your minimum qualifications. And then, again, like I said, the RFA and application process will be open for 60 days for each of these RFAs. At that point, once you submit it, that's when it gets really quiet from us as an agency, because that's when the evaluation process happens. That's evaluator assignment, application evaluation, and all the score calculation that happens within it. Being transparent about the process, that is a 60 to 90-day window that we really can't talk to you about the RFA because it's in the evaluation process in terms of that. The next time that you would hear from us is really at that intent to award. And that's when we publicly announce who was successful in that application of that RFA and who was less successful in that process. And it's a very formal process that is sent out through that same mechanisms that we release the RFAs. New to this process this time, and you've always been able to get application feedback or applicant feedback in the process, but there will be a link in that intent to award notification that if you want information, if you want to sign up to get information about your application and just some feedback of that, you can sign up through that process that will be detailed in the RFA within that. Then once the intent to award is happened, that's when the award process is really going into full swing. So that's when there's an appeal process. YDO has a specific appeal process outlined in the RFA that you can't appeal that you didn't like your score, but you can appeal if you feel like we did not complete the processes as outlined in the RFA within that. And that's specific to us as an agency that we offer that for you as applicants. At that point, once the intent to award happens, that's when insurance and grant agreements will all start happening with it. Just a note, in my understanding, this is across all state grants, is we allow reimbursement back to July 1 of 2025 for this upcoming biennium, but you will not be able to get reimbursed if you do not demonstrate insurance at that point in time. And so there's kind of 2 things that have to happen to be reimbursed, is that you have to have an intent to award, or you have to have execute a grant agreement, and you have to have insurance that demonstrates the required insurance for that grant application. The piece that is difficult in that process is you cannot get an executed grant agreement unless you have insurance, and that's going to be a process that you'll work directly with ODE procurement and the single point of contact of the RFA to demonstrate that insurance. But the date on that insurance is where you will be able to be reimbursed back to. So those of you that have current insurance, current grants from us, you would most likely continue that insurance across that time frame. But if you are new to YDO and you're having to go out and seek that insurance, there will be a delay in that process for sure. Hit pause. Cord, I see that you're answering some questions, so I appreciate that. All right, next slide, please. So as we dive deeper, this is really where we foresee the upcoming RFA releases. And so you might notice this looks slightly different than it has in the past. And the biggest piece being that we are implementing a staggered release of RFAs. And we're doing that to really make sure that we have time and that ODE procurement has time to process those applications as they come in. As I said earlier, we had over 400 applications the last large RFA process that we opened. And quite frankly, that just flooded the system that we want to ensure that process is happening. So we anticipate re-engagement opportunity grant being released here in mid-March to early April, followed then by job and work readiness in that late March to mid-April range. And so those will be relatively close within that. Both of those funds are state general fund or corporate business tax funds. And so they are state funds that are associated with that. You'll notice that community investment has a broader estimated release, and the reason being is that we are watching that at the federal level to see where those federal funds land in terms of having that. We are currently planning to receive those funds, but we want to make sure that we watch that process over the coming months within that. So we hope to have that released mid to late spring 2025. And that last one, youth violence and gang reduction grant, just being very transparent. That is an RFA we have chosen to put on hold, and we have not started writing that yet. So we have a very broad estimated release and more information to come in the fall of 2025 within that work. You'll note down there on the bottom that application window of open to 60 days. But the big piece about a staggered release, there is a staggered work at the end once we have gone through the evaluation. So what that means to you as an applicant is that we will have staggered intent to awards based on this same release model. And we hope to have the first intent to awards going out for re-engagement opportunity grant mid to late summer. So that's that July, August range within that. And then the other ones would follow suit in terms of that process within it. Recognizing that has impact on folks in terms of that window, but we wanted to make sure that we were being transparent and clear of that process along the way. Next slide, please. I'm going to keep going because I know that we're tight on time, but these are some new application and award limits that if you've joined the work groups over the last 8 months, you may have seen us talking about this. I would also recommend if there's more information that you want to know something specific that I'm sharing, those work group presentations and slide decks are on our website that you can access and review some of that information as we've gone through that process these last 8 months. But new to this RFA process, we are issuing application limits, and so an applicant, and applicant is actually a defined term in the RFA, but basically it is an organization that has the same executive leader or leaders and or the same board. And so by talking about what an applicant is, school districts are kind of a good example of that. So an applicant in the school district would be the school district itself, being that they have a superintendent and they have a school board overseeing that system. And so individual schools might apply within that system, but these application limits are limited per applicant as defined in the RFA. So for each applicant, an applicant could submit one application in re-engagement opportunity, one application in job and work readiness, and up to 2 applications in community investments. So any applicant can submit up to 4 applications in these 3 RFAs. And you see on the bottom there, each applicant must provide one program in one location or other areas. That's some language that was in RFAs, but we just want to be really clear that an applicant defines what the location is itself. So just being aware of that in your application within it. But you can't use 2 community investment grants, for example, to pay for the same program for the same youth being served. It has to be in separate locations, separate youth. Next slide, please. This next slide has a lot of information, so I'm going to quickly go through kind of where this means. And again, you can see that those defined terms are in a lot of this in bold for it. But some of the biggest things to note is that for this upcoming biennium, each applicant is going to be limited to total $600,000 or limited to $600,000 in total awards across our community investment, re-engagement opportunity, and job and work readiness grants. So if you apply in all 4 and are successful, that is really great to do that, but you will be then working with most likely myself and ODE procurement to determine which of those successful applications you want to have funded as part of your project. We felt strongly as an agency that you know your services and your programming and projects the best, and we want to offer that opportunity for you to choose in terms of what is funded should you be successful within that. So jumping back up to the top of that slide, we have what's going to be called funding levels that are consistent across all 3 of these all of these RFAs. And so awards for current operational projects, and that would be a time application currently serving youth, and collecting individual level participant data, have some funding levels established. So if you're a returning grantee in that funded RFA type, you could apply for up to $300,000 per application. If you are new to YDO or you're new to that RFA type, you can apply up to $200,000 per application. And so talking a little bit more specific of that, if you're a re-engagement opportunity grantee in 23-25 biennium, you could apply up to $300,000 in re-engagement opportunity grant. as a returning grantee for a current operational project. You would, if you wanted to apply for the job and work readiness grant, you could apply for up to $200,000 per application for operational project because you were new to that, serving that type of RFA type. Now, for programs that are new or startup or seasonal, not meaning they not operational at time of application, or they just don't simply collect individual level participant data, for any of those awards or in applications, you may apply for up to $150,000 per application or per award. All right. Doesn't look like we're having any questions, so I'm going to keep going. Just a note, because of the shared screen, it is pretty limited on if we can see you raising your hand or not. So please do put that into chat. Oh, also to note, you see the asterisk down there, re-engagement opportunity grants, because of legislation, does require individual level participant level for any funding level of that grant. And
Hey,
that's
Paul, this is Cord.
progress. Yes.
I was just this was a question that came in the chat, and I provided an answer in the chat, and hopefully this table kind of adds a little more detail to it. But I think maybe the thing that's worth noting is you pointed out in re-engagement opportunity grants, this individual level participant data was already a requirement. So this is a new thing in community investments for folks that have had a community investment grant. The question we had, someone said, well, I've been providing essentially semi-anonymized number for youth. And we would be asking folks to provide actual individual level participant information and to do so via secure collection process. It wouldn't be quite the same reporting method. So we'll more about that for folks that ultimately we can get to the stage of we'll have some examples I think for folks as we kind of get to the award process to help you understand what that looks like. But yeah, that is kind of a different type of individual level participant data than what you may have seen in the community investments before.
Thank you, Court. And I just see a question come into chat. Court, you'll probably respond to that as well. But yes, you are hearing that correct. Is the estimated release date for community investments is mid to late spring. That's going to really put us into that intent to award into that September, October range within that. And then there was a question about why YDO needs names of youth. And really, it goes down to that we, as Brian shared, we live underneath Oregon Department of Education, and as that, we are an educational entity. So what we can do by collecting names is kind of twofold. One, we can align with educational data and have a high accuracy rate having that name included into it. Ultimately, what it means to organizations would be less data collection for you, for us to be able to analyze the data further of the youth within the educational system. We also note that having that name, we then can really appreciate or really analyze where youth are being served across all of our grants versus individually. So having that name is a way for us to internally connect that work. Brian, I see your hand raised.
I'm just noting we got like 1 minute left. So keep it rolling.
I'm going to keep rolling. Yeah.
Thanks,
So
Paul.
let's go to the next slide and appreciate those. I recognize some folks have to jump offline. So we'll finish these last couple slides. We'll stay on for questions. We'll end the recording that we can address those pieces, but we will have this posted upcoming. So just some key updates to anticipate is that staggered RFA release and then ultimately that staggered intent to award. The funding level updates, you really want to read that when these RFAs are launched. And as Cord talked about, individual level participant data is something that we've done across our grants, but it is getting more specific around that, and it will be submitted through a secure portal of submission. The biggest change within that, Future Ready and re-engagement have always collected name of participant. Community investments will now require you to submit that name in that process. And so the thing to think about is if you were using that data collection tool that did the random number with their name, essentially you will be working with the name and not necessarily that random number within that. Another note to do is that letters of partnership is a required piece that is across all of our grants. Ultimately, we want to know that you have partners or are working with the community in which you're intending to serve with the project. A couple things about that is a letter of partnership would be required. So you're required to submit two. There are some specifics around that. So if you're going to subcontract for over $25,000 with another organization, they would be one that would be required to submit a letter of partnership. The other piece would be is if you're required to work with another organization to have access to youth or the site. So for example, if you're a community-based organization serving youth in the school, you would need to have a letter of partnership from the school or school district that you would have access to that space within that work. Outside of that, it's just going to be some questions that we'll ask that you'll share out to the partners that you work with to serve youth across that. Updated evaluation and scoring processes. We've talked a lot about that in terms of it. The big change there is that if you've applied or known about our processes in the past, we are no longer using tabulation meetings or evaluator teams. And essentially what that means is that your application will be randomly assigned to evaluators to review it across each RFA. Also note that if you are interested in participating as evaluator, that is something that you can do as an applicant as long as you are not connected to that RFA. So if you're applying in that specific RFA, you couldn't review within that, or if you're a partner within an RFA, you couldn't review applications within that. But if you're applying in community investment and would like to review re-engagement opportunity grants, that is something that is open to you. You can email me directly within that. And then lastly, increased word count. One of the biggest feedback things we've heard from applicants is we want more words in terms of the evaluation items. And so we have increased that word count. A suggestion that I would put out there, though, is if it is a word count for an evaluation item of 800, I would encourage you to try to have your response around maybe 750 words so that you can ensure that when you take it from the format that you're working, maybe in Word, and copy pasting it into the SM Apply or SurveyMonkey Apply application system, that'll be a seamless transition for you along that side. I'm going to keep going. I see a hand raised, but let's come back to those. So just a note, if you are a current grantee, if we can go to the next slide, please. Some anticipated RFA specific RFA updates, right? Re-engagement opportunity grant. You will be required to either deliver or partner deliver all the re-engagement services. So you will have to do some work to make sure that all of those re-engagement services that has been consistent in our RFAs and are those grants that you're serving and providing that across the system. You also will be required to track participants' progress until high school completion or the grant cycle ends. And so that basically what that means is it's not just a single course that you're offering through re-engagement. It is going to be that support until that youth graduates or completes high school within that. The next slide, please. For job and work readiness grants, obviously the new RFA type, the name is the big thing, but that's the combining of Future Ready and CI workforce readiness initiatives. It's going to look similar to what you've seen in Future Ready with required essential employability skills and required paid work experience and or industry recognized credential. As we said earlier, instead of the youth priority youth, it'll be focus on youth furthest from opportunity within that work, and then that required connection to education service provider. It does not mean that you have to provide education, but as a job and work readiness grantee, we want to ensure that you're able to connect youth back to the education system should they maybe need high school completion supports within that. And then this last slide is our community investment. Again, the biggest change is that removal of initiatives within that, as well as the individual level participant data updates. So just a reminder that if you are submitting at those funding levels that require individual level participant data, it will now require that you submit the name of the individual participant. Another note that is really trying to be very transparent on where our funding comes from. So all of our federal funds will be aligned in community investment grant. So as it stands right now, if you were a successful applicant in there with the funding that we anticipate, you would have approximately 80% of federal funding, Title 20 dollars, and then approximately 20% of general fund across those grants. So that no longer is it going to be assigned or kind of molded to what makes the most sense. If you apply in community investment grant, most likely you will have that Title 20 funds connected to your grant within that. Next slide, please. All right, so Melissa put it in there, I believe, kind of a next steps checklist. It's a PDF, so please feel free to use that in that work. And those slides will take you to those QR codes will take you to our email list. The link is also there on that same document, as well as SurveyMonkey Apply to create those accounts. And I think that's the last slide for me. So I'm going to hit pause contact information, feel free to reach out to Brian and I. I believe Brian and I will hang on to address questions that you might have. Again, thank you all for attending this work. Hopefully it was helpful in information for you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I know we're about 5 minutes over, but we got through a lot of information. It was fast and furious. So it seems like we answered most of the questions either in the chat or just kind of um, just in the presentation. I don't know, Cord or Melissa or anybody, Tanasia, is there anything that's lingering? And I did see somebody ask a question that they thought they just might follow up with us about what data would we be analyzing, especially for younger kids. Yeah, maybe Sarah, we can follow up with that. As Paul said, I think it's just helpful for us to get our data across different grant programs so that we can kind of see what kinds of services and supports young people are getting through the dollars that we are providing. And if it's in multiple grant areas, then we can say, oh, this young person is being served through this prevention program. And then maybe a couple of years later, maybe this young person ends up in a workforce program. So um, it's really just helping us kind of have a understanding of the impact in a biennium, but also potentially, I don't want to get out over my skis, but over the years. So I don't know. Looks like Cord, you answered that. So verification, deduplication of applicants, totally perfect, Cord. Thanks for answering. I don't know. We should probably sign off since we're over time.
No.
Thank you, Paul. Any last words?
Well, I just appreciate people's times and feel free to email Brian and I, and we will get, if we don't answer the question, we will get you to the right person to address the question. And actually, as a good reminder, please do that before the launch of the RFAs, because once the RFA is launched, that's when you get the email from us saying we have to have you connect with the single point of contact for that official response. All right, Melissa, I think we can end recording.
Exactly.